Dead America, Las Vegas, The Bachelor Party. By Derek Slayton, Chapter 1, 2:13 a.m., 3 miles west of Las Vegas. Lucas sat behind the wheel of the SUV, his foot firmly on the gas as the vehicle sped down the darkened highway. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides, broken only by the occasional sagebrush and the distant glow of Vegas bleeding into the night sky. To his right sat Brent, his friend and co-worker for the last 5 years, head tilted back against the headrest, eyes fighting to stay open in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. Normally at this hour on a weekday, they would be sound asleep in their respective beds, dreaming of weekend plans and complaining about Monday morning meetings. But this was a special occasion. In less than 2 weeks, Brent would be stepping up to the altar to marry his college sweetheart. So this was his final trip as a free man. If it were up to Lucas, they would have flown out to Vegas like civilized human beings, and he would have shown Brent 72 hours that he would have reminisced about on his deathbed. The snore coming from the back seat reminded him of why that wasn't happening. Directly behind him was Jacob, who despite being 30, looked like he was barely out of high school with his thin frame and baby face. His mouth hung open as he dozed, completely oblivious to the world around him. To his right sat Carter, the best man, who had somehow managed to fold his tall frame into a position that looked remotely comfortable. While Lucas felt like he was the man for the job, he wasn't upset that the best man duty fell to Carter. Brent and Carter had been friends since elementary school and had gone through many a rough time together. Plus, it meant that Lucas could focus on what he did best, live life to the fullest without the responsibility of keeping track of rings and speeches. The highway stretched ahead of them, empty except for the occasional semi-truck hauling cargo through the night. Lucas glanced at the speedometer, noting he was pushing 85 in a 70 zone, but at this hour there wasn't a cop in sight. "Hey Carter," Lucas called over his shoulder. "You may want to wake up sleepy back there. The strip is about to pop up." Carter stirred, blinking a few times as he tried to get his bearings. He stretched as much as he could in the confined space, joints popping audibly. "Finally," Carter groaned, rolling his shoulders. "I don't think I've felt my legs since prim." Carter reached over and shook the smaller frame Jacob, who snapped out of his stupor with a start, nearly jumping out of his skin. "Huh? What's going on?" Jacob mumbled, wiping drool from the corner of his mouth. "Are we there yet?" "Just about, little buddy," Lucas replied, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. "We didn't want you to miss seeing the strip on the horizon, it being your first trip to Vegas and all." "Thanks, Lucas," Jacob said, forcing a smile. Jacob feigned politeness, even though Lucas had always talked down to him like he was some kind of mascot. While they hadn't interacted much over the years outside of work functions and group hangouts, Jacob got the sense that Lucas saw him as a kid brother who shouldn't be invited along on the big boy adventures. Despite the constant slights and condescending comments, he put it aside for his friend Brent, not wanting to do anything that might ruin their multi-day outing. This was Brent's time, and Jacob wasn't about to let his own bruised ego get in the way of that. The SUV crested a small hill, and suddenly the conversation died as all 4 men caught their first glimpse of the lights ahead. "So what do you say, wedding boy?" Lucas asked, his excitement building as they drew closer to their destination. "Are you ready for your last few nights of freedom?" Brent rubbed his eyes and stretched, trying to work the kinks out of his neck from the awkward sleeping position. "I think I would have been a lot more ready if you had let me actually sleep through the night," Brent replied with a yawn. "I still have no clue why you thought it was a good idea to show up at my house in the middle of the night and drag me out." "Because every second counts, my friend," Lucas declared, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. "Plus, with as popular the strip club gets this time of year, the only time I could book your bachelor party bash was 3 in the morning. Everyone in the car stared at Lucas incredulously, the silence stretching uncomfortably long. "What?" Lucas asked, genuinely confused by their expressions. "You woke me up, dragged me out of bed, and drove me across the desert because you wanted to hit a strip club?" Brent asked slowly. "Not just a strip club," Lucas protested, "but the best strip club in this time zone." Jacob shook his head in disbelief. "Time zone? Really? That's your choice of measurement?" "Look, I just need you all to trust me," Lucas said with a wave of his hand. "This is going to be worth it. I mean, when have I ever led you astray?" The question hung in the air for a moment before Brent cleared his throat. "There was that work trip to New York," Brent said dryly. "I'm pretty sure I'm still banned from the subway." "And your birthday party from a couple years back," Carter added with a chuckle. "I can't remember the last time everyone got the birthday boy the same thing. Bail money." Okay, so I've led you all astray a few times," Lucas admitted, his enthusiasm undimmed. "But this isn't one of those times." There were some murmurings in the vehicle, but Lucas couldn't tell if they were agreeing with him or just too tired to argue anymore. The topic quickly changed when they came around a gentle bend in the highway, revealing the Vegas Strip, gleaming in the distance like a neon oasis in the black desert. "Wow," Jacob breathed, pressing his face to the window. "That's a hell of a sight." "Told you that you didn't want to sleep through it," Lucas said smugly. "And you were right," Jacob admitted. The city lights illuminated the night sky, piercing the darkness like a beacon in the void. Towering hotels and casinos stretched toward the heavens, their facades alive with moving advertisements and brilliant displays. Even from miles away, the spectacle was overwhelming. They continued staring at it in silence for several moments, each man lost in his own thoughts about what the next few days might bring. Finally, Lucas brought them back to the moment. "All right, boys," he announced, his voice full of anticipation. "Let's get ready to party." The group perked up despite their exhaustion, knowing that their long drive was nearly at an end. It took several more minutes for them to make the drive into town, Lucas taking an exit several miles away from the main strip, much to everyone's confusion. "Where are we going?" Jacob asked, craning his neck to look around. "So this club isn't exactly on the strip," Lucas explained, navigating through a series of side streets. "Or near it. But trust me, it's worth it." The other three men exchanged worried looks, which quickly dissipated as they pulled into a massive parking lot. The building that rose before them was enormous, easily the size of a supercenter store, with enough exterior lights to signal a passing airplane. The parking lot was filled with cars despite the late hour, everything from beat-up economy vehicles to luxury sports cars gleaming under the floodlights. Lucas cut the engine and began smacking the steering wheel in excitement, his energy infectious despite the early hour. "All right," he declared, practically bouncing in his seat. "Let's do this." The others perked up, forcing themselves to let out some cheers, as if they were willing themselves to have a good time. They climbed out of the SUV, stretching road-weary muscles and adjusting clothes that had been wrinkled during the long drive. The desert air was surprisingly cool, and the sounds of music and laughter drifted from the building ahead of them. As they walked across the asphalt toward the front entrance, their footsteps echoed in the stillness. As they approached the front door, a giant black man stepped out of the shadows, apparently having spotted them walking up. He was easily 6 feet tall and nearly as wide with his muscles, arms like tree trunks crossed over a chest that could have doubled as a shield wall. He looked down at the group with the kind of calm confidence that suggested he'd handled much worse than 4 tourists. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said in a voice like distant thunder. "The name's Moose." Jacob, either brave or stupid from exhaustion, decided to engage. "Moose? Like the animal?" "Yes, like the animal," Moose replied, his stare boring into Jacob like a drill press. "Also, like just as strong as a moose." Moose continued staring down Jacob, who let out a subtle nod, suddenly too afraid to say anything else. The smaller man seemed to shrink under the bouncer's gaze. "Good," Moose continued with satisfaction. "Now that we have that out of the way, let me tell you gentlemen about the rules of this fine establishment. Do I have each and every one of your attention?" The 4 men glanced at each other with expressions that ranged from nervous to terrified, before turning back to Moose and nodding like bobbleheads. "All right," Moose said, his tone taking on the quality of a professor lecturing unruly students. "The rules are simple. While it is an undeniable fact that we have some of the most beautiful women you're ever going to see prancing around in various states of undress, they are there for you to look at and look at only." He paused to let that sink in before continuing. "The only, and I mean only, time you will ever feel their skin against yours is if you are holding a $20 bill, or bigger, in your hand. In this situation you may, if the lady so desires, feel her hand against yours as she liberates that bill from your grasp. Is everybody following along?" Moose stared down each of the men individually, paying special attention to Lucas, who had the look of someone who might need extra supervision. Lucas shakily nodded in agreement. "All right now," Moose continued, his voice taking on an even more serious tone. "If one of you sees fit to break my rules and touch one of these lovely ladies, just know that I believe in biblical justice. Eye for an eye type shit. So, if you touch them, then I'm going to touch you. And let me also add that the ladies enjoy watching those who break the rules get what's coming to them, and they tip accordingly. On an unrelated note, I drive a sports car that costs more than some of the houses out here. I'm going to let you boys do the math on that yourselves." The men exchanged worried glances, each one doing mental calculations they didn't want to complete. "Now, am I going to have any trouble out of you boys?" Moose asked, pulling out his phone and making a show of looking at it. "Or should I do some window shopping on my phone for some new rims?" All four men talked at once, shaking their heads frantically and putting their hands up in surrender, letting him know they would behave like perfect gentlemen. "That's good enough for me, gentlemen," Moose said with a satisfied smile. "Now, please, enjoy yourselves." Moose stepped to the side with surprising grace for such a large man, pulling open the heavy door and revealing a smoke-filled, laser-light show interior. The thumping bass coming from the sound system hit them squarely in the chest, vibrating through their rib cages like a second heartbeat. "Come on, gentlemen," Lucas said, his earlier enthusiasm returning now that they had passed the bouncer inspection. "Let's have ourselves one hell of a night." Lucas led them inside, their eyes struggling to adjust to the extreme lighting that shifted from strobing white to deep red to electric blue every few seconds. The interior was even more impressive than the exterior had promised, with multiple stages scattered throughout the massive space and captivating entertainment on each one. Dancers moved with practiced precision on elevated platforms, while scores of men watched from strategically placed tables and chairs, throwing back cold ones as they reached into their pockets for bills to show their appreciation. The four friends stood near the entrance for several moments, soaking it all in and looking for a spot to sit that wouldn't require them to take out a second mortgage. The air was thick with smoke and the competing sense of alcohol, cologne, and something else they couldn't quite identify. Before they could get their bearings, they spotted a panicked bit of flashing light coming from the far corner, aimed directly at the front entrance. "What the hell is going on over there?" Carter asked, squinting through the haze. Before anybody could figure it out, Moose pushed past them with purpose, his earlier friendly demeanor replaced by something much more serious. "Time to get me a new set of rims," he said grimly. The four men watched with morbid fascination as the giant bouncer moved swiftly across the club floor. Dancers and customers alike stepped to the side, parting like the Red Sea as the hulking man rushed toward the disturbance with the inevitability of a freight train. Even though the commotion was a good 30 yards away, each of the men winced as they saw Moose pick up a man by the back of the shirt and slam his face into a nearby table with tremendous force. The blow was powerful enough that they heard the impact from across the room over the pounding music, but it did little to deter the troublemaker, who thrashed about violently as if he felt no pain. "Looks like he got into some bad stuff," Brent observed, watching the man continue to struggle despite what should have been a knockout blow. A split second later, one of the dancers ran up to them from the direction of the disturbance, her sequined outfit catching the flashing lights as she moved. She was motioning frantically for them to move out of the way, her face displaying visible signs of distress and something that looked like genuine fear. They parted automatically, allowing her to push through toward what they assumed was a phone or office. "Are you okay?" Jacob asked, his concern overriding his usual shyness. "That crazy son of a bitch bit Candy," she gasped, not slowing down. "He bit her?" Lucas asked incredulously. "Took a chunk right out of her," the dancer confirmed, her voice shaking. "I gotta call an ambulance." The dancer continued moving, ducking around the corner to where a phone presumably was, leaving the four men standing there processing what they'd just heard. The foursome looked at each other, having a silent conversation with raised eyebrows and meaningful glances. The party atmosphere had evaporated completely, replaced by something that felt distinctly wrong. "So, how do you guys feel about drinking at the hotel before check-in?" Lucas asked, his voice lacking its earlier enthusiasm. The other three men nodded in agreement without hesitation, none of them particularly interested in sticking around to see how the situation with the biter played out. They quickly retreated through the door, headed back to the SUV at a pace that was just short of running. Chapter 2. Lucas drove them through the darkened streets just outside the downtown area of Vegas, navigating past closed businesses and empty lots. The neon glow of the casinos cast strange shadows through the windshield, but none of the usual excitement that accompanied a Vegas trip was present in the vehicle. Everyone sat mostly quiet, lost in their own thoughts as they tried to process what had just happened at the club. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Lucas finally broke it, his voice lacking its usual bravado. "Don't worry, Brent," he said, glancing over at his friend. "I have no doubt that the club owner will accommodate us tomorrow night." Brent shifted in his seat, rubbing his temples where a headache was beginning to form. "If he was going to accommodate us tomorrow," Brent replied with barely concealed irritation, "then remind me of why you drugged me out of the house in the middle of the night to drive here from Los Angeles." "Because the club was unable to perform tonight," Lucas explained with the kind of logic that only made sense to him. "So he owes us." Carter leaned forward from the back seat, his brow furrowed in confusion. "How do you know the club was unable to perform? You didn't even talk to anybody." "Well, for starters, I specifically booked Candy," Lucas said matter-of-factly. "And I doubt anybody would want her to perform after getting bitten." Carter nodded slowly, processing the information. "Yeah, that makes sense." The conversation lulled again as they passed under a flickering streetlight, the intermittent illumination casting eerie patterns across their faces. Brent stared out the passenger window at the empty sidewalks and shuttered storefronts. "So, what are we supposed to do until check-in?" Brent asked with a weary sigh. "I'm not sure I can just sit and drink until the afternoon." Jacob suddenly perked up in the back seat, his earlier drowsiness replaced by genuine excitement. "Oh, we could have an early lunch at the Gladiator Arena," he exclaimed. The enthusiasm in Jacob's voice was so unexpected that it caught everyone off guard, especially since Lucas was nodding his head in agreement instead of his usual dismissive response. "I'm down for some mixed martial arts fisticuffs while we eat," Lucas said with renewed energy. "That's a hell of a suggestion, Jacob. I wouldn't have pegged you as an MMA fan." Jacob's face scrunched up in confusion as he processed Lucas's words. "MMA? No, I'm talking about the Gladiator Arena," Jacob explained, his excitement building as he spoke. "It's this really cool place that's built like a Roman Colosseum. They stage real gladiator fights in the middle while you eat your meal. It looked really cool online." Lucas's expression shifted from enthusiasm to understanding, then to his more familiar condescending smile. "Historical gladiator battles," he said slowly. "Okay, your excitement makes a lot more sense now." Jacob's face began to flush with embarrassment, and he was about to retreat back into his shell when Carter spoke up forcefully, taking command of the situation before it could devolve into the usual dynamic. "Or, we could hit the grocery store, stock up on drinks, and go check in at the hotel," Carter interjected with authority. "I sprung for the red-eye check-in. It was a little extra, but as long as it's after 4, they'll give us a room." Brent turned around to look at his best man with appreciation. "And you wonder why I picked him as my best man," he said with a grin. Lucas clutched his chest dramatically, pretending to be wounded by the comment. "But I got you boobs," he protested. "Spectacular ones at that." "And if I ever get to see them," Brent replied with perfect timing, "you just might vault into the lead." The sentence hung in the air for a moment, the absurdity of the situation finally hitting them all at once. The entire car broke into laughter, the first moment of levity they had shared since leaving the strip club. The tension that had been building dissipated as they all gave in to the ridiculousness of their circumstances. After a few moments, Carter leaned forward and pointed through the windshield to the left side of the road. "Grocery store up on the left," he announced. "All right, now we're talking," Lucas said, his natural enthusiasm returning as he spotted their destination. As they approached the store, Lucas began organizing their mission with the kind of tactical precision usually reserved for military operations. "When we get in there, Jacob and Carter will be on snacks, while Brent and I handle the booze," he declared. "I sprung for the sweets," Carter added, "so we should have a full kitchen, so I'll pick up some hot wings." Brent turned around again to face his best man. "See, best man?" Yeah. Lucas waved him off. "I might have to up the boob game if I'm going to beat him out." The group chuckled as they pulled into the parking lot, their good mood immediately evaporating as Lucas slammed on the brakes, the SUV lurching to a stop. "What in the fresh hell is this?" Lucas muttered. In the parking lot just by the front entrance of the store sat 3 large moving vans, their back doors open wide like the mouths of mechanical beasts. Dozens of figures moved with military precision, swiftly loading boxes and supplies into the vehicles. Even in the dim lighting, it was clear these weren't civilian movers. Upon closer inspection, they could see that the men were soldiers in full fatigues, their assault rifles slung over their shoulders as they worked. "There's something you don't see every day," Brent observed, leaning forward to get a better look. "What are they doing?" Carter asked, his voice carrying a note of concern. "Looks like they're loading up for a hell of a party," Lucas said, though his usual joking tone sounded forced. Jacob squinted through the windshield, trying to make sense of what they were witnessing. "Nellis Air Force Base is close to here," he offered. "Those boys do know how to party," Lucas replied, though he didn't sound convinced by his own explanation. Carter shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly ready to move on. "Well, more power to them. I guess we're hitting the next store." "Nah," Lucas said with characteristic stubbornness. "Surely they're not taking everything?" Against the better judgment of his passengers, Lucas drove through the lot, parking just across from one of the trucks where they had a clear view of the operation. The soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, their faces grim and focused. Before Lucas could get out of the car, a soldier emerged from around the side of the nearest truck. His rifle was no longer slung over his shoulder, but held at the ready in his hands, immediately putting the others on edge. Lucas paid the weapon no mind, putting on his customary sleazy charm, as he shut the door and started walking toward the soldier with the confidence of someone who had never met a situation he couldn't talk his way out of. "I'm sorry, sir, but this store is closed," the soldier said in a firm, professional tone. The nameplate on his uniform read Tucker, and despite his youth, he carried himself with the bearing of someone who had seen more than his share of serious situations. "Come on, soldier," Lucas replied with his most winning smile. "We've had ourselves a long drive, and want nothing more than to pick up some beer and wings before we hit the hotel." "I understand, sir," Private Tucker replied without budging. "But unfortunately, this store is closed." Lucas inched closer to the soldier, instinctively keeping his hands visible where Tucker could see them. He leaned in slightly, reading the name patch on the soldier's fatigues. "Look, Tucker," Lucas began, shifting into his most persuasive mode. "I'm going to level with you. It's been a hell of a night. See, it's my boy Brent's bachelor party." He gestured toward the SUV, where his friends waited. "We drove all through the night from Los Angeles out here to hit the strip club, but the special performance I shelled out a pretty penny for got canceled when some nut job went and bit one of the dancers. Like, can you believe that? Just ripped a chunk right out of her arm, like she was prime rib." At the mention of someone being bitten, Private Tucker's entire demeanor changed. His grip tightened on his rifle, and his eyes sharpened with what looks like recognition. But Lucas was too involved with his performance to notice the soldier's reaction. "So look, Tucker," Lucas continued, spreading his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. "I'm not asking for much. Just let me run in there and grab a couple cases of beer, and we'll get out of your hair. Please, I'm asking man to man. Help bail out this nightmare of an evening." Tucker looked around quickly, scanning the area to see if his superior officer was within sight. The loading operation continued around them, but none of the other soldiers seemed to be paying attention to their conversation. When he was satisfied that he wasn't being observed, Tucker put up his hand, signaling for Lucas to stop where he was. "Stay right here. Do not move," Tucker instructed with quiet urgency. "I'll be right back." Tucker slung his rifle over his shoulder and quickly vanished around the corner of the truck, moving with the kind of purpose that suggested this wasn't a casual favor. Lucas looked back to the others in the SUV, giving them a confident smile and a thumbs up, clearly pleased with his negotiating skills. A few moments later, Private Tucker emerged from around the side of the truck, carrying 2 cases of beer, moving quickly, but trying not to draw attention to himself. "This is all that was within reach," Tucker explained in a low voice, "but it should at least get you boys started on the night." Tucker moved to hand the cases over to Lucas, who paused before taking them. Reaching into his pocket, Lucas pulled out a wad of bills and quickly peeled off a 20, holding it out for the soldier to take. "Go on, Tucker," Lucas said with a conspiratorial wink. "I won't tell anybody." The private stared at the money for a moment, and Lucas noticed something strange in his expression. It wasn't greed or gratitude, but something closer to pity, as if the money was completely meaningless to him. Regardless, Tucker took the bill and handed over the beer. "You boys ought to get going," Tucker said with quiet intensity. "If my sergeant sees you, it's going to take a lot more than $20 and a sob story to let you go." Lucas understood the implicit threat in the private's words, quickly turning around and moving back toward the SUV with unusual haste. "You're doing the Lord's work, Tucker," Lucas called over his shoulder. "You have yourself a fine evening." "Good luck out there, man," Tucker replied, and there was something in his tone that made Lucas pause. Lucas wasn't sure what to make of the private's parting words, but he shook off the uneasy feeling because he was just happy to have accomplished his mission. He rushed back to the SUV, where Jacob had already opened the door and was ready to take the 2 cases of beer. Lucas dove into the driver's seat, throwing the vehicle into drive and hitting the gas with more urgency than usual. He navigated them to the edge of the parking lot, looking both ways carefully before pulling out onto the street. "You are one smooth-talking son of a bitch, Lucas," Brent said with admiration. "That's why I make the big bucks, brother," Lucas replied, his confidence fully restored. There was a smattering of laughter in the vehicle as Lucas pulled out onto the road, the tension from the military encounter already beginning to fade. They drove a couple blocks through the quiet streets, stopping at a red light where Lucas drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. Just before the light changed and he made the turn, the sharp crack of gunfire echoed from somewhere behind them. It wasn't much, just a couple of shots. But in the stillness of the early morning, they carried clearly through the air. Jacob twisted in his seat to look back through the rear window, trying to see if he could spot the source of the gunshots. All he could see was the quiet, darkened street they had just traveled, with no sign of whatever had caused the disturbance. He looked to the others, but they were all facing forward, apparently lost in their own thoughts, or simply not having heard the distant shots. Rather than bring it up and potentially worry everyone, Jacob decided to shake it off and just enjoy the ride to downtown. The streets were mostly quiet as they made their way toward the Strip, with only a few cars driving about and a handful of pedestrians scattered on the sidewalks. Even for this time of year, and at such a late hour, the lack of activity seemed unusual for a city that never slept. None of the men seemed to mind the emptiness, as they were content to take in the sights as Lucas drove them down the famous Strip. The massive hotels and casinos rose on either side of them like neon mountains, their elaborate facades promising excitement and adventure. Before hitting the heart of the tourist district, Lucas made a turn, taking them a block away from the main thoroughfare before making another turn. He drove for a few blocks through quieter side streets before finally spotting their destination. The hotel, while not quite as large as the mega resorts on the main strip, was still gigantic and lavish by any reasonable standard. Its facade was covered in lights and elegant architectural details that spoke of luxury and comfort. "Here we are, boys," Lucas announced with satisfaction, "our home for the next few nights." Lucas made the turn into the parking deck, weaving around each concrete corner as he made his way up through the levels. The garage was mostly empty, with only scattered vehicles parked throughout the massive structure. He continued climbing until he reached the 4th floor, which had only a smattering of cars spread across the vast expanse of parking spaces. "Why did you drive us all the way up here?" Carter asked, looking around at all the empty spaces they had passed. "Because the walkway is on the 4th floor," Lucas explained with the air of someone revealing a professional secret. "No waiting for elevators when we want to hit the town." Carter nodded approvingly. "Hard to argue with that." Lucas parked the SUV and turned off the engine, the sudden silence feeling almost oppressive after hours of road noise and conversation. "Come on," he said, clapping his hands together. "Let's get checked in, because I'm ready to drink." Chapter 3. The 4 men walked across the covered walkway toward the casino, their footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. They had decided to leave their luggage and newly acquired beer in the SUV until they could get their room keys, figuring it would be easier to make one trip with everything once they knew where they were going. The walkway was mostly empty at this hour, with only the occasional person making their way between the parking garage and the hotel. As they walked, they passed a middle-aged couple heading in the opposite direction, nodding politely to them in the universal acknowledgement of fellow travelers. Other than those brief encounters, the passage was quiet, their voices carrying in the enclosed space. As they got closer to the casino entrance, the familiar sounds of Vegas nightlife began to filter through the air. The loud chimes and electronic tones of slot machines created a symphony of possibility, punctuated by the occasional shout of celebration or groan of defeat. The cacophony grew louder with each step, promising the kind of excitement that had drawn millions of people to this desert oasis. It wasn't long before they could see the lights illuminating the gaming floor through the large windows, casting colorful patterns on the walkway around them. The neon glow painted everything in shades of red, blue, and gold, creating an almost otherworldly atmosphere. "Come on," Carter said, taking charge of the navigation. "The check-in is on the first floor. Elevators are on the left." The group followed Carter, who had clearly been to this particular hotel before and knew his way around. They made their way through the entrance and down to the first floor, emerging into the main casino area where the sounds they had been hearing became a full assault on their senses. On their right were a handful of gaming tables scattered across the carpeted floor. Most of the blackjack and craps tables sat empty, their green felt surfaces waiting for players, but a couple of them had dealers standing ready for business, shuffling cards or arranging chips with practiced precision. Jacob's eyes lit up as he took in the scene, his earlier exhaustion forgotten in the face of gambling excitement. "Once we get checked in, I have to play a hand of blackjack," he announced. "We're here for a few nights," Brent replied reasonably. "We have plenty of time." "My mom gave me $20 to play for her as soon as I got here," Jacob explained with the kind of earnestness that only came from someone who took maternal instructions very seriously. "I promised her that I would." Lucas turned to stare at Jacob with an expression of complete bewilderment. "You promised your mom that you'd gamble?" he asked incredulously. "She's eccentric," Jacob replied with a shrug. "Not the word I would use," Lucas muttered under his breath. Before Jacob could formulate a retort to Lucas's implied insult, Brent spoke up loudly, clearly trying to head off another round of verbal sparring. "Hey, look, there's the check-in desk," he announced, pointing across the gaming floor. Lucas chuckled to himself, clearly enjoying the effect his needling had on Jacob, but he allowed himself to be redirected toward their actual objective. As they approached the marble-topped reception desk, a young woman emerged from what appeared to be a back office. She couldn't have been more than 19, with long blonde hair that cascaded over her shoulders and the kind of polished appearance that suggested she had stepped directly out of a sorority recruitment pamphlet. Her name tag read, Felicia, in elegant script letters. "Good evening, gentlemen, and welcome to the Royal Flush Casino and Hotel," she said with rehearsed professionalism. "I'm Felicia. How can I help you?" Before Carter could step forward to handle the check-in process, Lucas put on his most charming smile and moved to position himself directly in front of the young woman. He leaned against the counter with practiced casualness and gave her what he clearly thought was his most winning wink. "Oh, I can think of at least a dozen different ways you can help me out, Felicia," he said, with the kind of sleazy confidence that had probably gotten him slapped more than once. Felicia stared at Lucas with an expression that managed to combine contempt, amusement, and professional resignation in equal measure. She took a moment to gather herself, her smile never wavering, even as her eyes grew noticeably colder. "Normally, this would be the part of the conversation where I would step away and let one of my male counterparts deal with you," she said, with the kind of sweet venom that only someone in customer service could master. "But seeing as how everybody called out tonight, I'm gonna have to power through. Before we continue, however, just know that you would need an electron microscope to have any hope of finding my loyalty to this place. So if you would like to see the inside of a room before 7 a.m. when my relief arrives, I'd suggest letting someone else talk." Lucas stood there completely shell-shocked, his mouth hanging open slightly as he tried to process what had just happened. He had clearly never encountered someone who could dismantle his entire approach with such surgical precision. After several moments of uncomfortable silence that seemed to stretch on forever, everybody except Lucas broke into laughter. Even some of the nearby casino patrons turned to see what was causing the commotion. Brent stepped forward and grabbed Lucas by the arm, physically pulling his stunned friend away from the front desk. "Come on, Lucas," he said with obvious amusement. Let's go watch Jacob lose $20 of his mother's money." Carter remained at the desk, pulling out his wallet as he addressed Felicia. "I'll be over there once I get us checked in," he called after his friends. "I'll make sure he doesn't get us kicked out before we can get into the room," Brent replied over his shoulder. "That would be appreciated since I prepaid," Carter responded with a grin. Brent chuckled and nodded at his best man as he joined the others making their way toward the blackjack tables. Carter then pulled out his license and credit card, handing them over to Felicia with an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry about him," Carter began, struggling to find diplomatic language. "He's a bit of a—" Carter paused, clearly having trouble finding the right word to describe his friend's behavior, but Felicia had no such problem. "He's an entitled douchebag that is most likely on a list that makes it illegal for him to be within 1,000 yards of a school," she suggested helpfully. Carter let out a laugh, shaking his head in amazement at her directness. "I don't think he's quite that bad," he replied. "Of course, now that I think about it, I wouldn't go so far as to vouch for him." "Probably a wise idea." Felicia paused to look at the license. "Carter?" "I've been known to have them in my time," Carter replied with a smile. Felicia began typing on her computer, but she couldn't resist continuing the conversation. "So, what are you doing here with a loser like that?" she asked without looking up from her screen. "It's my best friend Brent's bachelor party," Carter explained with a resigned sigh. "It wasn't my call to bring him along." "The things we do for friends, huh?" Felicia observed. "Tell me about it," Carter agreed wholeheartedly. Felicia continued typing for a few moments before suddenly muttering curses under her breath, her professional demeanor slipping for the first time. "Is everything okay?" Carter asked with concern. "The printer out here is acting up again," she explained with obvious frustration. "I'm going to have to print your room keys in the back office." "It's no problem," Carter began, but before he could finish his sentence, he heard Brent, Lucas, and Jacob yell out in celebration from across the casino floor. "I think they're going to be a minute anyway," he finished with a chuckle. At the blackjack table, Jacob stared down at the king and ace sitting in front of him with wide eyes, hardly believing his luck. The dealer, a well-dressed middle-aged man with the kind of professional composure that came from years of dealing with every type of player imaginable, pushed a handful of chips across the felt toward Jacob. Both Brent and Lucas smacked the smaller man enthusiastically on the back in celebration, their excitement infectious even to the normally reserved dealer. "That's 2 wins in a row," Lucas said with amazement. "How in the hell are you this lucky?" "I don't know," Jacob replied with a self-deprecating humor. "I'd say I was born with it, but I mean, look at me. I'm a 30-year-old who gets carded for R-rated movies." Both of his friends broke out into laughter at his observation, and even the professional dealer couldn't suppress a smile. The well-dressed man took a moment to compose himself before getting back to business. "What's your bet, sir?" the dealer asked, returning to his professional demeanor. Jacob looked uncertainly between his growing pile of chips and his friends. "I don't know, Brent. What do you think?" "It's your mom's money," Brent replied with a grin. "What would she do?" Jacob's response caught everyone off guard, including the dealer. "Oh, I haven't played my mom's money yet," he said matter-of-factly. Lucas grabbed Jacob by the shoulders with sudden intensity, shaking him while letting out what could only be described as a maniacal laugh. "That's my boy," he declared with obvious pride. "I knew there was something I liked about you." Jacob, emboldened by Lucas's unexpected approval, looked down at his chips with newfound confidence. "So I should let it ride?" he asked. "What's the worst that can happen, huh?" Lucas replied with the kind of logic that only made sense in Vegas. "We got a couple cases of beer in the car, the promise of some spectacular tits-in-your-face tomorrow, and if you have the balls to let it ride, I'll buy the tickets for the Gladiator show myself." Jacob's eyes lit up at the mention of the Gladiator show he'd been excited about earlier. "Hell yeah, let it ride, my good sir," he declared with uncharacteristic boldness. The dealer wasn't entirely sure how to process what he had just heard, but he had plenty of experience ignoring the odd things players said during the heat of gambling. It was Vegas after all, and the overnight shift had never been known for attracting the most well-balanced individuals. "Okay, bets down, here we go," the dealer announced with professional calm. The dealer pulled a 10 from the top of the deck, sliding it smoothly across the felt toward Jacob, who immediately perked up with excitement. After dealing himself a face-down card, He pulled a 9 from the deck and placed it next to Jacob's 10. Come on, be kind to us," Lucas muttered under his breath, staring intently at the dealer's hidden card. The dealer reached for another card, flipping it over to reveal an 8. "That's what I'm talking about," Lucas shouted, loud enough to draw attention from nearby tables. Jacob looked around uncertainly. "That's good, right?" "Hell yeah, that's good," Lucas confirmed enthusiastically. "So I'm standing, right?" Jacob asked, still not entirely confident in his gambling knowledge. "Even I know that's a stand," Brent added with a laugh. "All right, I'm standing," Jacob declared, trying to sound more confident than he felt. The dealer flipped over his hole card, revealing a queen that gave him 18, one less than Jacob's 19. The three friends erupted into another frenzy of celebration. "That's my boy!" Lucas shouted, pumping his fist in the air. "You keep this streak up and we'll be in the penthouse before you know it." Before Jacob could decide on his next bet, the sound of a scuffle erupted from about 20 yards to their right. Everyone at the blackjack table turned to watch as a middle-aged man in an expensive suit struggled with a younger man who appeared to be in his 20s. "What are you doing? Let me go! Let me go!" the older man shouted, his voice carrying clearly across the casino floor. The younger man didn't respond verbally, instead making a menacing groaning sound that seemed to come from deep in his throat. It was an unsettling noise that didn't sound entirely human. The older man managed to hold his own, grabbing the other man's arms and pressing them against his body in an attempt to control the situation. "Get away from me!" the middle-aged man yelled with increasing desperation. Summoning all his strength, the older man stepped forward and shoved the younger man with everything he could muster. The force of the push was tremendous, lifting the smaller man completely off the ground. He flew backward, landing hard on a nearby craps table before flipping completely over it and crashing to the floor on the other side with a sickening thud. "Jesus Christ," Brent muttered, wincing at the impact. The dealer at their table remained calm, clearly having seen his share of casino disturbances over the years. "The next hand might be a minute, fellas," he said apologetically. "Do what you gotta do, man," Brent replied. The dealer pulled out his radio, adjusting the frequency before clicking it on. "I need security over to the blackjack pit," he spoke calmly into the device. The dealer looked around the gaming floor for any sign of a security officer, but couldn't spot any in the immediate area. The three friends did the same, scanning the casino for help, but the overnight security presence seemed to be minimal. As they searched, something unexpected happened. The man who had been thrown over the craps table suddenly jumped back to his feet with an energy that seemed impossible given the violence of his fall. Instead of being dazed or injured, he appeared to lock onto the sound of the radio clicking on and off with predatory focus. The creature, for it no longer seemed entirely human, let out an excited moan that raised the hair on the back of everyone's necks. Then, without warning, it began sprinting hard down the aisle toward their group with a speed and intensity that defied explanation. The blackjack dealer looked in the direction of the approaching threat just as it got close enough to leap at him. "Oh my God!" Chapter 4. Lucas, Brent, and Jacob watched in stunned silence as the rage-filled figure slammed into the blackjack dealer with tremendous force. The impact sent the well-dressed man tumbling backward, his arms windmilling frantically as he tried to maintain his balance. His efforts were futile, and he tripped over his own feet before landing hard on his back with a sickening thud that echoed across the casino floor. The creature that had attacked him let out an excited moan that seemed to come from somewhere deep in its throat, a sound that was decidedly inhuman. Without hesitation, it went in for what could only be described as an attack, opening its mouth wide and sinking its teeth deep into the shoulder of the fallen dealer. The man let out a pain scream that cut through the ambient noise of the casino like a knife, his voice cracking with agony as the ghoul ripped flesh from bone with disturbing enthusiasm. Blood began to pool on the carpeted floor beneath them. "What the hell?" Brent gasped. Brent and Jacob stood frozen in place, staring at the horrific scene unfolding before them in complete disbelief. Their minds struggled to process what they were witnessing, as if their brains were refusing to accept the reality of the situation. Lucas, however, reacted on pure instinct. Without a moment's hesitation, he broke away from the blackjack table and rushed around to where the dealer was being savaged. He reached down with both hands, grabbing the zombie by the back of its shirt and yanking it upward with all his strength. "Come here, asshole," Lucas shouted. Lucas twisted his entire body, using the momentum to yank the creature up and off the dealer before throwing it backward with tremendous force. The ghoul went completely off balance, its arms flailing as it sailed through the air before landing hard on the casino floor with a bone-jarring impact. But instead of staying down like any normal person would after such a fall, the thing immediately began scrambling back to its feet with unnatural speed and agility. Within seconds, it was upright again, and without any pause to recover from the impact, it began racing back toward Lucas with single-minded determination. Lucas did what he could to brace himself for the inevitable collision, planting his feet and raising his arms defensively. But his preparation wasn't enough, as the zombie launched itself through the air and tackled him to the ground with bone-crushing force. They landed in a tangle of limbs right at the feet of the dealer, who was now bleeding out onto the carpet in an expanding pool of crimson. The ghoul thrashed about wildly on top of Lucas, its movements erratic and violent as it grabbed onto his arm with surprising strength before going in for a bite. "Help me!" Lucas yelled desperately, his voice cracking with fear and pain. His cry for help snapped Brent and Jacob out of their shocked stupor. Both men immediately rushed around the gaming table to help their friend, their feet slipping slightly on the blood-slicked carpet. But despite their quick response, they were a crucial step too late as the ghoul managed to sink its teeth into Lucas's forearm. Lucas let out a scream that was part pain and part terror, bucking wildly underneath the creature as he tried desperately to get it off of him. The zombie seemed to relish the taste of fresh flesh, chewing its newfound treat with disturbing enthusiasm. Just as the situation seemed hopeless, Brent reached them. Without hesitation, he wrapped both arms around the waist of the creature, lifting it completely off the ground and away from his wounded friend. The ghoul's jaws made a wet tearing sound as they were forcibly separated from Lucas's arm. Brent spun around in a complete circle, swinging the ghoul with him as he built up momentum. Then, with all the force he could muster, he brought the creature down hard toward the unforgiving surface of the gaming table. The zombie's head connected with the wooden edge of the blackjack table with a sickening crack that resonated through the immediate area. The sound was unmistakably that of a skull, fracturing under tremendous impact, and immediately the creature's violent thrashing ceased. Brent released his grip on the ghoul, allowing its now lifeless body to collapse to the ground in a heap. He remained in a defensive crouch, his muscles tensed and ready to react if the thing somehow managed to get back up. But after several tense seconds, it remained completely motionless on the blood-stained carpet. Jacob rushed over to where Lucas was struggling to get back on his feet, offering his shoulder for support. "Good God, man, are you okay?" Jacob asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. "Hell no, I'm not okay," Lucas replied through gritted teeth, his face pale from shock and blood loss. "Look at my arm." Lucas held up his wounded forearm, which was bleeding profusely from the ragged bite marks. The wound was deep and ugly, with torn flesh hanging in strips where the creature's teeth had done their work. Jacob quickly spotted a napkin dispenser on a nearby stand and grabbed a thick stack of the thin paper squares. "Just put pressure on it," Jacob instructed, slapping the inadequate napkins against the wound. Lucas suppressed the urge to curse at Jacob's feeble attempt to stop the bleeding, knowing that the thin cocktail napkins weren't going to do much good against such a serious injury. But it was better than nothing, and at least Jacob was trying to help. Brent turned around after he was convinced that the creature was truly down for the count. Rather than focusing on Lucas's injury, he stepped over to where the blackjack dealer lay motionless on the floor, clearly in the final moments of his life. Before Brent could kneel down to attempt any kind of first aid, all three men flinched as the sharp crack of gunfire erupted from across the casino floor. They spun around to see a security guard in a crisp uniform firing several rounds from his service handgun, the muzzle flashes illuminating his determined face. The bullets were flying toward two more creatures that were rushing toward the guard. The ghouls covered ground with frightening speed, but the security guard kept his composure and continued firing with practiced precision. The creatures managed to get within 10 yards of the security guard before one of his bullets found its mark, striking one of them directly in the head. The ghoul dropped to the ground instantly, its body going completely limp as it hit the carpet. The guard quickly processed this information, adjusting his aim accordingly. He sent another well-placed round through the head of the second ghoul just as it was about to reach him, dropping it mere feet away from where he stood. "I don't know what the hell is going on," Brent said, "but I'm going wherever he's going." Brent glanced back at Jacob and Lucas, both of whom were nodding in complete agreement with his assessment. The security guard clearly knew something about how to deal with these things, and right now, that made him their best hope for survival. The three of them began running toward the security guard, who was already moving with purpose toward the check-in desk area. Their footsteps echoed across the casino floor as they navigated between overturned chairs and scattered gaming chips. As they emerged from the maze of gaming tables and got into the main aisle that cut through the casino floor, the trio suddenly froze in place. The security guard had caught sight of them out of the corner of his eye and was now aiming his handgun directly at them with steady hands. "We're not like those people," Brent shouted desperately, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. The guard maintained his aim for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Finally, he seemed satisfied that they were indeed still human and lowered his weapon slightly. Before the trio could begin moving toward him again, the guard's eyes suddenly went wide with alarm. He quickly raised his gun once more and began firing rapidly, but this time his aim was directed just to the side of where the men were standing. The three friends looked behind them in horror, spotting half a dozen bloodied creatures emerging from the nearby bank of slot machines. The things moved with that same unnatural speed, their clothes torn and stained with what was clearly blood from previous victims. The guard's bullets were flying in their direction, but his aim was slightly off target. Several rounds caught the ghouls in the chest and torso, but the impacts seemed to have little effect on their forward momentum. None of the shots were hitting what was apparently the only target that mattered: their heads. "Move now!" the guard shouted over the sound of gunfire. They didn't need to be told twice. All three men began racing toward the security guard, who continued firing at the approaching horde while smoothly ejecting his spent magazine and slamming in a fresh one with practiced efficiency. As they reached the guard's position, two more figures joined their impromptu group. Felicia and Carter emerged from the check-in area, both looking terrified, but determined to stick together. "What do we do, Adrian?" Felicia asked, her professional composure completely gone as she looked to the security guard for guidance. "Get to the break room! Go!" Adrian commanded. Felicia immediately turned and began running toward a door near the check-in area that was marked "Employees Only." The rest of the group followed without any debate or hesitation. As they ran across the open space, Adrian continued firing toward the half-dozen creatures that were in hot pursuit. His accuracy had improved dramatically now that he understood what he was dealing with, and he managed to take down two more of them with clean headshots that dropped them instantly. The security guard turned and picked up his pace, his longer strides allowing him to catch up with the others, just as they reached the employee door. Felicia fumbled briefly with her employee badge before swiping it on the security reader beside the door, which beeped and clicked as it unlocked. She pushed through the door, holding it open for the others to race through to safety. The employee area beyond was a stark contrast to the opulent casino floor, with plain concrete walls and utilitarian fluorescent lighting. Just as Adrian was about to follow the others through the doorway, he heard someone calling out desperately from the direction of the coffee shop across the main floor. He stopped in the doorway, scanning the area for the source of the cry for help. Adrian quickly spotted three people running toward their position from the far side of the casino. They appeared to be hotel guests, terrified and panicked, but inexplicably dragging their luggage behind them as they fled. It was as if their fear had completely overwhelmed their common sense, preventing them from realizing that they should abandon their belongings and simply run for their lives. Adrian raised his handgun in their direction, preparing to provide covering fire to help them reach safety. Before he could fire a single round, however, at least a dozen more creatures suddenly emerged from the main entrance to the casino. The automatic motion sensor doors opened smoothly to accommodate them, as if the building itself was welcoming the creatures inside. Adrian watched in helpless horror as the pack of ghouls slammed into the group of fleeing guests, like a wave breaking against the shore. The creatures swarmed over the trapped people, completely overwhelming them through sheer numbers. A few panicked screams resonated from the center of the writhing mass of bodies, but the human voices were quickly drowned out by the excited moaning and snarling of the feeding creatures. The luggage was scattered and forgotten as its owners disappeared beneath the horde. Adrian stepped back into the employee corridor, grabbing the heavy door and slamming it shut just as a couple of creatures broke away from the feeding frenzy and began rushing toward his position. The door's automatic lock engaged with a solid click. Adrian kept his full weight pressed against the door for several moments, making sure it would hold against any potential assault from the other side. When he was confident that the barrier was secure, he backed away slowly and spun around to face the long employee hallway that stretched ahead of them. "Adrian, what is going on?" Felicia asked, her voice shaking as she struggled to process everything she had witnessed. The guard didn't respond verbally to her question. Instead, he held up his hand in a gesture that clearly meant for everyone to be quiet and stay alert. He took point position, keeping his handgun trained down the length of the hallway as unsettling sounds echoed through the empty corridor. The noises were difficult to identify exactly, a combination of scraping, shuffling, and what might have been moaning, but they were definitely coming from somewhere ahead of them in the employee area. Everyone remained on high alert as they followed Adrian down the hallway, their footsteps muffled by the commercial carpeting. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows that seemed to move and shift as they walked, creating an atmosphere of dread and uncertainty. As they approached what appeared to be a break room at the far end of the corridor, the disturbing noises intensified significantly. Whatever was making those sounds was clearly just ahead of them, separated only by the thin wall of the employee break room. Adrian motioned for the others to stay put as he approached the doorway. The group complied without question, pressing themselves against the wall as he stepped carefully into the threshold of the break room. He raised his handgun and aimed it into the room, his finger ready on the trigger. What he saw inside caused him to freeze momentarily, his mind processing the horrific scene before him. A figure in a dealer's uniform was hunched over another employee on the floor. The zombie was methodically chewing on what appeared to be still warm flesh, while its victim lay completely motionless beneath it, clearly beyond any hope of rescue. Adrian didn't hesitate once his initial shock wore off. He squeezed the trigger, sending a single bullet through the back of the creature's head. The ghoul immediately collapsed on top of the corpse. Its feeding finally ended. Adrian began to lower his weapon and relax slightly, thinking the immediate threat had been neutralized. But as he did, he spotted movement coming from the body on the ground beneath the now dead zombie. At first he wondered how the victim could possibly still be alive after what had been done to them. But it didn't take long for him to realize that this wasn't life in any conventional sense. At least, not the kind of life he recognized. The newly turned zombie began thrashing about violently, clearly agitated by the fact that it couldn't get up and move freely due to the weight of its killer pinning it to the floor. Its movements were erratic and desperate, driven by an hunger that seemed to override any other consideration. Adrian let out a long, defeated sigh as he raised his gun once more. He took careful aim and put a single round through the struggling creature's head, finally ending the threat completely. After several moments of tense silence passed with no further movement from the break room, Adrian turned back to face the others. "Come on," he said firmly. "We need to lock this place down." Chapter 5. Inside the cramped employee break room, the group of 6 huddled together in a state of collective shock. The harsh fluorescent lighting cast unflattering shadows across their faces, highlighting the fear and confusion etched in their expressions. None of them could fully process what they had just witnessed on the casino floor, and the silence stretched uncomfortably as each person tried to make sense of the impossible. The break room itself was a stark contrast to the opulent casino beyond the door. Basic institutional furniture, a small kitchenette with chipped countertops, and motivational posters that seemed absurdly out of place given their current circumstances. Finally, after several tense moments that felt like hours, Adrian spoke up, his natural authority making him the de facto leader of their desperate group. He pointed over to Carter, who was still catching his breath from their frantic escape. "What's your name there, Hoss?" Adrian asked. "I'm Carter," he replied, gesturing to his companions. "And that's Brent, Jacob, and Lucas." "Good deal. I'm Adrian," the security guard said with a firm nod. "Could you do me a favor and give me a hand with these bodies? I just want to get them over to the corner there." Carter looked down at the 2 corpses sprawled on the break room floor, hesitating for a moment as his mind rebelled against the gruesome task. But he understood the necessity of it and finally nodded in agreement. "Yeah, I can do that," he said reluctantly. "Good," Adrian replied. Felicia, there's a med kit underneath the sink there. See what you can do about that dude's arm there. Felicia nodded and walked over to the small kitchenette, opening the cabinet beneath the sink to retrieve the first aid supplies. As Adrian and Carter began the unpleasant work of moving the bodies, Jacob pulled out his cell phone with shaking hands. I'll call the cops, Jacob announced, punching in 911 with trembling fingers. Adrian looked over at Carter as they carefully lifted the first corpse, gently shaking his head with the expression of someone who already knew what the outcome would be. Jacob held the phone to his ear, letting it ring for what felt like an eternity. After a solid minute of waiting, Jacob pulled the phone away from his ear and stared at it in disbelief. How are they not answering? He asked incredulously. Somebody has to be there. I'm sorry, man, Adrian said as he and Carter positioned the body in the corner, but I didn't have any luck either, and I have a direct line to them. Jacob's face went pale as the implications of that statement sank in. So what does that mean? He asked in a small voice. It means we're in deep shit, Lucas said grimly, wincing as Felicia began cleaning his wound with antiseptic from the first aid kit. The sting of the medicine on his torn flesh made him suck in a sharp breath. But he looked at Felicia with gratitude. His earlier smarmy attitude had completely disappeared, replaced by something approaching humility. So, about what I said earlier, Lucas began awkwardly. Let me guess, Felicia replied without looking up from her work. This wasn't one of the things you had in mind when you were thinking about how I could help you? Felicia shot him a look that was equal parts amused and exasperated, prompting Lucas to let out a conceding laugh. Yeah, something like that, he admitted. Meanwhile, Brent had moved to the other side of the room and was pacing back and forth like a caged animal, his phone pressed against his ear with white-knuckled intensity. Come on, just pick up, he muttered under his breath. After several agonizing moments, he heard his wife's familiar voice coming through the phone. But his moment of relief quickly turned to disappointment as he realized it was only her voicemail message. He clicked the phone off, muttering curses under his breath. Is everything all right? Carter asked, having finished helping Adrian with the bodies. I tried Diane, but it went straight to voicemail, Brent replied with obvious frustration. It's the middle of the night, man, Carter said reassuringly. She probably has her phone on silent, especially after we woke the two of you up earlier. Brent let out a defeated sigh, knowing that Carter was most likely right, but unable to shake his growing anxiety about his fiancée's safety. Don't worry, man, Carter continued. I'm sure she's all right. The house is locked up tight, so even if this thing is happening back in Los Angeles, nobody's getting to her. Brent tried to process his friend's logic, doing his best to convince himself that Carter was right and that Diane was safe at home, probably sleeping peacefully and completely unaware of the nightmare they were living through. Okay, so she's safe, Jacob interjected, though his voice carried a note of skepticism. What about us? Lucas gestured toward his newly bandaged arm, the white gauze already showing spots of red where blood was seeping through. We're not nearly as safe as we'd like to be, he said darkly. It's just a flesh wound, dude, Jacob replied dismissively. Shake it off. That's easy for you to say, pipsqueak, Lucas snapped, his frustration and pain making him more aggressive than usual. You didn't have some crazy person take a chunk out of your arm. Before Jacob could fire back with his own retort, Adrian stepped between them with the kind of authority that brooked no argument. That's enough, the both of you, he said firmly. Both Jacob and Lucas immediately quieted down, looking at each other and nodding in grudging agreement that the security guard was right. This wasn't the time for petty squabbling. Jacob does bring up a good point, though, Carter said diplomatically. What are we going to do? Felicia finished taping Lucas's bandage and looked up from her work. Unless one of those things has a key card, they're not getting through the casino floor door, she pointed out. And even if they do somehow get through, we can just lock this door up tight and wait it out. Brent walked over to the breakroom cabinets, systematically opening them to assess their supplies. What he found was less than encouraging. The shelves were mostly barren, containing only a couple boxes of stale crackers and a few pre-packaged pastries that looked like they'd been there since the casino opened. And as long as help arrives in the next 36 hours, we're good to go, Brent said with heavy sarcasm. I don't think that's going to be happening, Adrian replied grimly. At least not in that short of a time frame. The rest of the group turned to look at Adrian with expressions of confusion and growing concern. "Do you know something we don't?" Brent asked directly. Adrian let out a long sigh, clearly reluctant to share information that would only increase their panic and despair. "Yeah, unfortunately I do," he admitted. "Adrian, what is it?" Felicia pressed, her voice carrying a note of dread. Adrian took a moment to collect his thoughts before speaking, as if he was being forced to relive memories he would rather forget. "Before I came down to the casino floor, I was in the security office watching the monitors," he began slowly. "I saw a couple of attacks go down, people biting other people, just like what we witnessed out there. So I called it into police dispatch." Adrian paused, running his hand through his hair as he continued. "Marianne answered the phone. Now she's usually the calmest, most level-headed person I know. It doesn't matter what the situation is. She's all business and gets things done. But when I called tonight, she was completely rattled." "We all have our off days, man," Lucas offered weakly. "Not Marianne," Adrian replied with certainty. "And not like this. She didn't ask for details, didn't ask what I needed, none of the standard protocol. I could tell that she was crying, that something was seriously wrong. She just kept repeating the same thing to me over and over. 'Get out. You need to get out.'" Adrian paused again, allowing that ominous message to settle over the group like a heavy blanket. "I tried to get through to her, to find out what was happening on her end, but she just kept repeating that same warning before she started screaming, and the line went dead." The room fell silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. "I tried calling back multiple times," Adrian continued, "but it wouldn't connect. Nothing but dead air." "So what does that mean?" Jacob asked, though his voice suggested he was beginning to understand. "It means we shouldn't count on anybody coming to save us," Carter said bluntly. "Of course someone is going to come save us," Jacob protested, his voice rising with panic. "That's what the police are there for." "You mean the police you just tried to call and couldn't get to answer?" Brent pointed out. "Yeah, them," Jacob replied desperately. "Well, I mean, surely they'll pick up eventually, won't they?" The group continued staring at Jacob in uncomfortable silence, allowing him to process the implications and come to his own conclusion. Just before the reality fully hit him, he perked up again with renewed hope. "Oh, what about the military?" he exclaimed. "That Air Force base is nearby, right? This is exactly the type of thing they're trained to deal with, right?" Felicia looked to Adrian for guidance. "Adrian, do you think the military would really help out?" "It's possible," Adrian replied carefully, "if this thing is as widespread as it appears to be." "Yeah, about that." Lucas trailed off, waiting for everyone's attention to focus on him. "We saw a bunch of soldiers at the grocery store earlier tonight," he continued. "They were looting the place." "Looting the place?" Felicia asked in shock. "Why would they do that?" "Because they know something really bad is happening," Adrian explained grimly, "and they want the supplies for themselves." Felicia's face went ashen as the full scope of their situation became clear. "My God, so we're really on our own?" "It appears that way," Adrian confirmed. "So what do we do?" Felicia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know about the rest of you," Adrian said with determination, "but I'm getting to my car and going home." "Going home?" Carter questioned. "Hell, man, we should be getting out of town entirely." "And go where?" Adrian countered. "There's nothing but barren desert around the city for hundreds of miles. If you think the food options in this break room are sparse, just wait until you're surrounded by nothing but dirt and cactus." Carter considered this for a moment before nodding reluctantly in agreement. The logic was sound, even if it wasn't what he wanted to hear. "Okay, so we're going to get back to our cars and go somewhere safe," Brent said. "I don't suppose you have a guest room, do you?" "I can't say that I do," Adrian replied honestly. "No offense, but I don't know any of you, and I barely have enough food in my place for myself." "You don't have to explain it to us," Brent said with understanding. "I'd probably say the same thing if I was in your position." "Can I come with you, Adrian?" Felicia asked hopefully. "Did you not just hear what I said?" Adrian responded. "I did, but I don't have a car, Adrian," Felicia explained, "and I don't think walking home through all of this is really an option." Felicia gave Adrian the most persuasive look she could muster, her eyes pleading with him to reconsider. Even though it went against his better judgment and his carefully laid survival plans, something in her expression made him relent. "Okay, fine," he said with resignation. "But you're taking the couch." "I have no problem with that," Felicia replied with relief. "So, what are we going to do?" Jacob asked, looking around at the group. "We're going to get back to our car and drive home to Los Angeles," Brent said with finality. "But what if this thing is happening there too?" Jacob asked, voicing everyone's unspoken fear. "Then at least I can die with my fiancé," Brent replied quietly. His stark statement didn't go over well with the group, but his three friends found themselves nodding in agreement. They all understood that it was their fault he wasn't at home with Diane right now, and the guilt was eating at them. "So what's the play?" Carter asked, shifting into practical mode. "How do we get back to the cars?" "We're going to fight our way up to the 4th floor and get across to the parking deck," Adrian explained. "We're already on the 4th floor," Lucas pointed out, "so we'll be good to go if we can get to the deck." "I'm on 4 too," Adrian added. "Easy access to the walkway, right?" Lucas asked. "Yep, no elevators for me, not with the kind of crowds this place draws," Adrian confirmed. "And especially not now," Brent added grimly. Everybody nodded in solemn agreement. "Okay, I've got my weapon," Adrian said, patting his handgun. "But if you boys are going to put up a fight, you're going to need something more than your fists. Come on, there's a storage room right across the hallway. You should be able to find something that works for you in there." Adrian moved toward the door, motioning for the others to follow him. He opened it carefully, checking the hallway before leading them across to another door marked storage. Inside was a large room filled with casino furniture, promotional signs, and various other items used to maintain the gaming floor. "Find yourselves something you like," Adrian instructed, checking his watch. "We're out of here in 5. Chapter 6. Adrian led the group of 6 back to the door leading to the casino floor, his service weapon drawn and ready. Behind him, the others clutched their improvised arsenal. The storage room had yielded a variety of blunt objects that would have to serve as weapons: metal chair legs torn from gambling stools, a large promotional signpost that had been advertising the weekend poker tournament, and a couple of maintenance hammers that had seen better days. While their makeshift weapons weren't exactly ideal for combat, they would have to get the job done in a pinch. The weight of the metal felt reassuring in their hands, even if none of them had any real experience using such implements for violence. "Okay," Adrian said quietly, positioning himself at the door. "When we get out of here, we're heading to the right. There's a bank of escalators about 50 yards down the main aisle. It's going to be a hall, but they'll get us up to the 4th floor." "Sounds easy enough," Brent replied, though his voice carried more confidence than he actually felt. "Then we just have to figure out how to get back to the interstate," Jacob added, his anxiety evident in his tone. "It's easy," Lucas said with characteristic bravado. "We just go back the same way we came in." "And if there's a wreck that blocks our path?" Jacob countered, his practical nature showing through his fear. Lucas thought about the question for a moment, his confidence wavering as he realized that Jacob was absolutely right. He knew the basic directions to get around Vegas, but one wrong turn in a crisis situation could throw him completely off course and leave them lost in a city overrun by monsters. "Just follow me," Adrian interjected before Lucas could respond. "I have to get onto the interstate to get back home anyway, so I'll get you there. Just don't follow me all the way to my house. I wouldn't want to make things awkward by having to slam the door in your faces." Brent and Lucas chuckled, giving him understanding nods to show they were on the same page. "Okay, is everybody ready?" Adrian asked, his hand on the door handle. The group gave him a collection of half-hearted thumbs up and nervous nods. Everyone understood they needed to move, but none of them were particularly excited about venturing out from their relatively safe haven into the chaos beyond. Adrian turned the knob slowly, gently pulling the door open just a crack to peek out into the casino floor. The creatures that had been pounding on the door earlier had apparently wandered off in search of other prey, but he could still see at least half a dozen of them within 15 yards of their position, shambling around the gaming tables like deadly tourists. The guard turned back to the others, using hand signals to communicate the positions of the nearby threats. Brent and Carter stepped forward, brandishing their makeshift weapons to let him know they were ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. Adrian took a deep breath, turned back to the door, and pulled it all the way open. He darted out onto the casino floor, moving swiftly to the right without waiting for the others to catch up. By the time everyone had exited the employee area, he was already 5 yards ahead of them. The nearby zombies immediately took notice of the sudden movement and noise, letting out excited moans that echoed across the gaming floor as they began racing toward the security guard with frightening speed. 2 of them focused their attention on Adrian, while 2 others locked onto Brent and Carter as they emerged from the doorway. Adrian spotted a seating area near a bank of poker tables and ran toward it, hoping to use the furniture to his advantage. He managed to reach the upholstered chairs just before the pursuing creatures did, planting his feet firmly and preparing for their inevitable attack. The ghouls were a couple yards apart from one another as they approached, which gave the experienced guard a tactical advantage he was quick to exploit. As the first zombie arrived within striking distance, Adrian reached out and grabbed onto its outstretched arm, using its own momentum against it by pulling it forward toward the chairs. The ghoul's speed betrayed it, and the creature tumbled headfirst over the furniture, landing hard on the carpeted ground, face first with enough force to produce an audible crack as its neck snapped. Adrian immediately ducked down as the second zombie approached, stepping forward and sticking his arm between its legs in a wrestling move he'd learned years ago. He lifted up with everything he could muster, picking the ghoul completely off the floor before slamming it down hard into the metal frame of the chairs. While Adrian dealt with his attackers, Brent and Carter found themselves facing their own life-or-death struggle. They swung their improvised weapons in unison as a pair of blood-soaked creatures got within striking distance, their timing remarkably coordinated for 2 people who had never fought together before. Both blunt objects connected solidly with the sides of the zombie heads, producing sickening cracks as skulls fractured and sent the creatures toppling over backward onto the casino floor. Neither man hesitated to deliver follow-up strikes, bringing their weapons down hard on the fallen ghouls' heads to make absolutely sure they were down for the count. The violent impacts echoed across the gaming floor, but the noise unfortunately attracted the attention of even more creatures. Adrian began to yell for the others to pick up the pace, but was forced to raise his handgun when a small mob of zombies emerged from around a nearby bank of slot machines. Blood soaked their mouths and clothing, evidence that they had been feeding on some poor gambler who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Get your asses moving," Adrian shouted over the chaos. He fired off several rapid shots, his training evident in his controlled breathing and steady aim. Several bullets found their marks in creature heads, dropping them instantly, while others struck zombies in the torso. The fallen ghouls created obstacles that tripped up some of their pursuing counterparts, buying the group precious seconds to catch up to the guard. They ran as a single unit now, pumping their legs hard as they tried to maintain pace with the growing mob of creatures behind them. The sound of their footsteps mixed with the moaning and snarling of the undead created a cacophony that seemed to attract even more attention from across the casino floor. After what felt like an eternity of running, the bank of escalators finally came into view directly ahead of them, rising like a mechanical stairway to salvation. Adrian maintained his speed as he reached the moving escalator, leaping up several steps in a single bound with the agility of someone half his age. He glanced back to confirm that the others were close behind, relieved to see them reaching the escalators just ahead of the pursuing zombie mob. The security guard ran halfway up the moving staircase before being forced to stop when a blood-covered zombie appeared at the top of the escalator and began running down toward him with single-minded instinct. Rather than waste ammunition, Adrian ran a few more steps upward before ducking down just as the attacking zombie lunged for him with outstretched arms and snapping jaws. Adrian sprung up from his crouch at the perfect moment, catching the ghoul squarely in the chest with his shoulder and using the creature's own momentum to swing it over the side of the escalator. The zombie let out a frustrated moan as it fell to the hard casino floor below, landing with a wet thud that suggested it wouldn't be getting back up. The guard continued running up the escalator, reaching the second floor and making a hard right turn to leap onto the next set of moving stairs. As he bounded up toward the third floor, he heard panicked screams from somewhere behind him. "No, no!" Jacob's voice cut through the ambient noise of the casino. Adrian looked over the side railing, down at the escalator just below his position, Jacob had been bringing up the rear of their group and was now swinging his metal chair leg with everything his small frame could muster. Unfortunately, his aim left a lot to be desired, and his strikes were hitting the creatures in the shoulders and arms, rather than delivering the killing blows to their heads. Adrian aimed his handgun over the side of the escalator, pulling the trigger several times in rapid succession. However, shooting accurately from a moving platform proved to be much more difficult than he had anticipated, and his shots were hitting the creatures behind the lead zombie rather than the immediate threat. Jacob let out a primal scream as he swung his improvised weapon again, this time making solid contact with the lead zombie's head. The impact dazed the ghoul slightly, causing it to stumble backward on the moving steps. As the creature fell, it instinctively reached out to steady itself and grabbed onto Jacob's chair leg, pulling on the makeshift weapon with surprising strength. Rather than immediately letting go of his only means of defense, Jacob held onto the metal chair leg for a second too long, and the zombie's pull caused him to lose his balance on the moving escalator. Lucas, who was just ahead of him, reached back desperately trying to grab his friend's arm and pull him to safety. But Lucas's fingertips missed Jacob's outstretched hand by mere inches. Jacob let out a terrified scream as he fell backward down the escalator, tumbling into the mass of pursuing creatures. The collision of living and undead flesh created a tangled pile of bodies on the moving steps, with Jacob trapped somewhere in the middle. "Jacob!" Lucas screamed, his voice cracking with anguish. Lucas started to turn around to help his friend, but stopped himself when he saw two creatures immediately latch onto Jacob's struggling form. In a split second that seemed to last forever, flesh was ripped from bone, and blood began spurting across the escalator's steps in crimson arcs. "He's gone!" Adrian shouted from above. "Move your asses!" The security guard kept moving upward, glancing back to confirm that the others were following his lead, rather than attempting a suicidal rescue mission. He was relieved to discover that the third and fourth floors appeared to be completely empty. No survivors to complicate their escape, but more importantly, no zombies to block their path to the parking deck. The surviving members of the group raced across the elevated walkway that connected the hotel to the parking structure, their footsteps echoing in the enclosed space. Adrian and Felicia headed directly toward his dark sedan, while the three remaining friends ran toward their SUV. "I'm going to be moving like a bat out of hell," Adrian called out as they reached their vehicles. "So keep pace with me." "Don't worry," Lucas replied grimly. "I'll be right on your ass." Adrian nodded before disappearing inside his car and starting the engine. Despite his injury, Lucas managed to get behind the wheel of the SUV, while Brent and Carter piled into the passenger seats, their faces still showing the shock of losing Jacob. "I can't believe we just left him like that," Brent said quietly as he fastened his seatbelt. "He was gone, man," Lucas replied, his voice heavy with emotion. "I saw it with my own eyes. There was nothing left to save." "But we could have," Brent began. "We couldn't have done shit," Lucas interrupted with unusual force. "Now, get that seatbelt on. I'm getting you home to Diane." Brent did the only thing he could do under the circumstances. He buckled his seatbelt and tried to get settled in for what promised to be a harrowing ride. His thoughts remained with the friend they had left behind on the escalator, but he forced himself to push those images out of his mind as Lucas started the engine. Lucas kept the gas pedal pressed down hard, picking up speed as he followed Adrian's sedan through the darkened levels of the parking structure. The security guard's dark blue car was difficult to track in the poor lighting, but Lucas managed to stay close enough to follow its taillights. Adrian didn't slow down as they reached the parking deck exit, plowing straight through the wooden barrier arm that was supposed to prevent people from leaving without paying. Wood splinters flew through the air as he cut the wheel hard to the right, tires squealing as he accelerated onto the street. Lucas followed suit without hesitation, keeping his front bumper practically touching Adrian's rear bumper as they raced down the road. They turned back toward the strip on the next block, and within moments they were on the main drag, headed back toward the interstate and what they hoped would be safety. They sped down the famous Las Vegas Boulevard, but the street was anything but the typical tourist paradise. People were running for cover everywhere, but the wide-open casino entrances were providing no safety for those seeking shelter inside. Zombies pursued the late-night gamblers and tourists in deadly foot chases that played out on every corner. Lucas glanced to his left, just in time to see a woman in an evening dress tackled by a handful of creatures near the entrance to one of the major casinos. Within seconds, she vanished underneath the pile of attacking ghouls, her screams audible even over the roar of their engine. "Look out!" Carter suddenly shouted from the passenger seat. Lucas snapped his attention back to the road, just in time to see Adrian's sedan T-bone a car that had run a red light at the intersection ahead. A split second later, another vehicle rear-ended their SUV, the driver apparently unable to stop any better than they could. The group inside the SUV was thrown around violently from the impact, the sound of crunching metal and honking horns quickly filling the air around them. Steam began rising from the crumpled hood of their vehicle. "Is everybody okay?" Lucas asked, shaking his head to clear the ringing in his ears. "Yeah, I'm good," Brent replied, checking himself for injuries. "What the hell happened?" "Some asshole ran the red light and took out Adrian," Lucas explained. Lucas adjusted his position to get a better view of the collision ahead of them. He could see movement inside Adrian's sedan, which was a relief. It meant the security guard and Felicia were still alive. Adrian opened his driver's side door, clearly intending to get out and assess the situation, but was forced to slam it shut again as a trio of blood-covered creatures immediately swarmed toward the sound. A few moments later, zombies began pawing at their SUV as well, their bloody hands leaving smears across the windows as they tried to find a way inside. The three men watched in growing horror as more and more creatures gathered around their disabled vehicle. Their mounting fear was suddenly interrupted by the sound of a car horn that grew steadily louder as another vehicle approached the intersection at high speed. The driver swerved at the last moment, apparently trying to avoid the wreckage by jumping the curb and driving on the sidewalk. The car managed to travel a few more yards before slamming into a large metal trash can, coming to an abrupt and violent stop. The noise of the crash pulled a couple of zombies away from their position toward this new disturbance. But even more creatures emerged from a nearby casino entrance to fill the void they had left behind. The three men sat in stunned silence inside their wrecked SUV, reality settling in around them. The front end was completely destroyed, steam pouring from the radiator, and they were surrounded by an ever-growing crowd of hungry undead. They were well and truly trapped, with no way to drive away from the nightmare that Vegas had become. So, what do we do now? Chapter 7. Several hours had passed since the survivors had become trapped in their vehicles, and the sun was now poking its head up over the eastern horizon, casting long shadows across the Las Vegas Strip. The golden morning light illuminated their dire situation with crystal clarity, revealing the full scope of the nightmare that had engulfed the city during the night. Zombies continued swarming around the wreckage like hungry vultures, their numbers seeming to grow rather than diminish as time passed. The monotony of their desperate situation was broken up only by the periodic sound of more cars joining the ever-expanding pileup, each new arrival accompanied by the screams of fresh victims and the excited moans of feeding creatures. Another car horn blared somewhere in the background, the sound sharp and urgent in the morning air. Brent adjusted his position to look in the side mirror, watching as yet another sedan tried to push its way out of a nearby casino parking garage. The driver was clearly desperate, but the streets were swarming with creatures, making it virtually impossible to get very far. Brent observed with grim fascination as the sedan pulled out into the chaotic street. The driver attempting to push through the mob of zombies only to collide with a wrecked car that had been abandoned in the middle of the road. The sedan tried to reverse course, but in the process it rolled over several of the creatures lying in the street, causing the vehicle to become hopelessly stuck on the pile of bodies. "Welcome to the club, pal," Brent muttered under his breath. "Another dumbass trying to drive through this?" Lucas asked, without looking up from where he was picking at his bandaged arm. "Yep," Brent confirmed. "How many is that now?" Lucas continued. "More than I care to think about," Brent replied wearily. Their quiet conversation caused Carter to jolt awake in the back seat, his head snapping up from where it had been resting against the window. He looked around with frightened, disoriented eyes for a moment, as if he wasn't entirely sure where he was or how he had gotten there. Once he realized he was still trapped in the SUV, his posture relaxed slightly. "Morning sleeping beauty," Lucas said with forced levity. Carter rubbed his eyes with the backs of his hands, trying to adjust to the harsh morning light streaming through the windows. "What the hell time is it anyway?" he asked groggily. "A little after 6, Brent answered, glancing at his watch. Carter looked out the window and immediately saw that the zombie mob surrounding their vehicle had only grown larger during his few hours of restless sleep. The creatures pressed against the glass like curious children at an aquarium, their dead eyes reflecting the morning sun. "I'm guessing things haven't gotten any better?" Carter asked. "Quite a bit worse, actually," Brent replied honestly. Carter hesitated before asking his next question, as if he was afraid of the answer. "Do we know if it's, he trailed off. "Happening everywhere?" Lucas finished for him. "Yeah, that," Carter confirmed. "Honestly, I don't really care at this point," Lucas said with resignation. "It's happening here, which is all that matters to us right now." Carter turned his attention to Brent, who had been unusually quiet. "Brent, have you been able to—" Carter began, but trailed off as he saw Brent shaking his head. "No." "I'm sorry, man. I'm sure she's—" Carter tried again. This time Brent held up his hand, cutting off his friend's well-intentioned but painful attempts at reassurance. "I can't think about that right now," Brent said firmly. "We need to figure out how to get someplace safe." "I hate to burst your bubble," Lucas interjected, "but I think this is about as safe as it's going to get for us. As soon as you open that door, your dinner, or breakfast, or whatever meal these things are currently serving." Brent looked over at Lucas with a slight smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. Without saying a word, he raised his arm up and pulled back the shade covering the sunroof, letting more natural light filter into their confined space. "Well, that's great," Lucas said sarcastically. "We can at least smell some fresh air before we die." "That's the spirit," Brent replied dryly. "I'm already missing a chunk of my arm," Lucas continued, gesturing to his bandaged wound. "So, I'm not exactly looking forward to losing any more pieces." "We have some room temperature beer if you want to get in the right frame of mind to die," Carter offered, trying to maintain their gallows humor. "Room temperature beer?" Lucas responded with exaggerated horror. "I think I'd rather take a header into the middle of that mob." "Look, we have to do something," Brent said, his tone becoming more serious. "If we don't, we're just going to sit here and starve to death over the next few days." "Well, we're open to ideas, man," Carter said, spreading his hands. Brent nodded thoughtfully before reaching up and opening the sunroof completely. He stood up in his seat, poking his head and shoulders through the opening to get a better look at the strip and their surrounding area. The view that greeted him was apocalyptic in scope. Traffic was at a complete standstill in both directions, with hundreds of zombies swarming through the maze of abandoned and wrecked vehicles. Most of the ghouls were concentrated behind them, stretching out for several city blocks, apparently focused on the newer cars that had joined the pileup during the night. Brent turned around to face forward, trying to look past the wreckage directly in front of them. Most of the massive casinos lining the famous street were wide open, providing no barrier between the interior spaces and the apocalypse outside. Zombies were swarming around the entrances to several of the buildings, but from his elevated position, Brent couldn't see what was happening inside the casinos themselves. With a defeated sigh, he retreated back into the relative safety of the SUV. "I have an idea," he announced, "but you're not going to like it." "Seems to be the way today's going," Lucas replied wearily. "What's the idea?" "We make a run for the casino up on the right," Brent said, pointing toward a large resort about 50 yards away. "The casino?" Lucas asked incredulously. "The casino that has a mob of those things standing right outside the entrance?" "Told you that you wouldn't like it?" Brent said with a shrug. "And what exactly are we supposed to do once we're inside?" Lucas pressed. "Hell if I know, man," Brent admitted. "But maybe there's a place to hide. Maybe we can get up to the hotel rooms. Maybe there are other survivors. All I know is that anything has to be better than just sitting here waiting to die." Lucas looked in the rearview mirror to make eye contact with Carter, who could only manage a non-committal shrug in response. "I'd rather die painfully and quick than sit here and starve to death over the next week," Carter said matter-of-factly. Lucas muttered a string of curses under his breath, before finally nodding in reluctant agreement. "Fine," he said with resignation. "So, how do you want to do this?" Brent paused for a moment, trying to formulate some sort of plan that might give them a fighting chance. Before he could organize his thoughts, however, A torrent of rapid gunshots suddenly erupted from somewhere behind their position. "Is that gunfire?" Carter asked, sitting up straighter. Brent immediately scrambled to poke his head back out through the sunroof. He couldn't tell exactly what was happening from his limited vantage point, but he could see zombies swarming around a casino entrance several blocks away, and many of them were dropping to the ground as gunshots continued to ring out from inside the building. The sound of sustained gunfire quickly reached the ears of the zombies surrounding the SUV, and their attention was immediately drawn away from the trapped vehicle. Brent watched with growing excitement as the creatures began running toward the distant gunfire, their primitive minds unable to resist the promise of fresh prey. "We have to go right now," Brent announced urgently, ducking back into the vehicle. He waited just another moment for the closest zombies to move past their position, before throwing open his door without further hesitation. Carter and Lucas didn't have time to debate the wisdom of his decision. They simply trusted their friend's judgment and followed his lead, scrambling out of the SUV into the dangerous morning air. Brent darted across the short distance to Adrian's damaged sedan, running directly to the passenger side door, where Felicia sat frozen with terror. He smacked his hand against the glass window, startling her out of her paralyzed state. "We have to go right now!" he shouted through the window. Felicia shook her head vigorously, clearly terrified of leaving the relative safety of the vehicle. But Adrian understood the urgency of the situation and immediately threw open his driver's door. "You gotta move, girl! You gotta move!" Adrian commanded with authority. Reluctantly, Felicia opened her door and stepped out onto the debris-strewn asphalt. Brent immediately grabbed her arm and pulled her along for a few quick steps to get her moving in the right direction. They had just reached the sidewalk when a couple of zombies emerged from the casino directly ahead of them, apparently having been drawn by the sound of car doors slamming and voices shouting. Brent rushed forward without hesitation, his makeshift weapon gripped firmly in both hands. He swung hard and true, catching the lead zombie squarely in the side of the head and sending it crashing to the concrete sidewalk. As he prepared for his next swing, 3 more zombies came running out from the same casino entrance. "Damn it," Brent cursed under his breath. Before he could deliver another blow, Lucas rushed past him, lowering his shoulder and planting it solidly into the midsection of the closest zombie. Despite his injured arm, he managed to lift the creature completely off its feet and drive it backward into the newcomers behind it. "Come on!" Lucas shouted, giving the entangled zombies a hard shove that sent them tumbling to the ground. Brent, Felicia, and Carter picked up their pace, trying to catch up with Lucas, who was now leading their desperate charge towards safety. Before they could cover more than a few steps, the sharp crack of gunfire erupted from somewhere behind them. Brent turned around to see Adrian being completely overwhelmed by a fresh wave of zombies that had appeared seemingly from nowhere. The security guard was firing his handgun as rapidly as he could at the multiple targets descending upon his position. His training showed in his accuracy, and he managed to put 3 precise rounds through the heads of attacking creatures, dropping them instantly. Despite his skill with the weapon, however, their numbers were simply too great for one man to handle alone. "Adrian!" Felicia screamed, her voice cracking with emotion. Felicia took an instinctive step back toward her friend, but her advance was immediately stopped by Brent, who grabbed her arm and pulled her away from the hopeless situation. Adrian managed to fire off a couple more shots before blood loss from multiple bite wounds prevented him from having the strength to squeeze the trigger. His weapon fell from nerveless fingers as the mob of creatures overwhelmed his position. The surviving foursome continued their desperate run up the sidewalk toward the casino entrance, with Lucas maintaining his position about 5 yards ahead of the group. The injured man fought like a beast possessed, swinging his improvised weapon at anything that got within striking distance. They had gotten to within 10 yards of the casino entrance when a massive horde of creatures suddenly began pouring out onto the sidewalk directly in front of them. The sheer number of zombies was overwhelming, easily 24 or more streaming through the wide casino doors. Lucas stopped in his tracks, apparently recognizing that his time was up. He glanced back at Brent one final time, and despite everything they had been through, he managed to flash his characteristic cocky grin. "Told you I should have been your best man," he called out. Without another word, Lucas began swinging his weapon wildly in all directions, deliberately drawing the attention of the zombie horde and keeping them focused on him long enough for the others to retreat to safety. Brent, Carter, and Felicia turned and ran back down the sidewalk the way they had come, their hearts pounding as they searched desperately for any form of shelter. Behind them, they could hear Lucas's final battle playing out, the sound of his weapon connecting with zombie skulls gradually becoming less frequent. The zombies that had been attracted to the distant gunfire were now turning around, drawn by the noise and commotion of their current desperate flight. The creatures were closing in from multiple directions, and their options were rapidly disappearing. Brent looked back toward their abandoned SUV, hoping against hope that they might be able to reach its relative safety. But those hopes faded with each passing second as more and more creatures closed the gap between them. "Get in here now!" An unfamiliar voice suddenly called out from their left. The trio's attention was immediately pulled toward the source of the voice, a waiter in a stained uniform standing in the doorway of what appeared to be a small restaurant, frantically waving them toward the entrance. They didn't have time to debate the wisdom of trusting a stranger, or to consider what might be waiting for them inside. With zombies bearing down on them from multiple directions, they ran toward the restaurant with everything they had left. The creatures continued their relentless pursuit, getting closer and closer with each second that passed. All three survivors pushed their bodies to the absolute limit, their lungs burning as they covered the final yards to the restaurant entrance. Carter was the last one through the doorway, and he immediately stopped to help the waiter pull the heavy door shut behind them. Together, they managed to get it closed just seconds before the first zombie would have reached them, and the waiter quickly flipped the deadbolt to secure their position. The three exhausted survivors collapsed onto the restaurant floor once they were safely inside, breathing heavily as they tried to process everything they had just experienced. The overwhelming sense of loss hit them like a physical blow. In the span of just a few minutes, they had watched both Adrian and Lucas sacrifice themselves to save the group. As they sat there trying to catch their breath, the waiter who had saved them stood over them with an expression of bewilderment and concern. "What in God's name is wrong with you people?" he demanded. "Why did you get out of your car?" "Because we didn't want to starve to death in there," Brent replied between gasps. "Starve to death?" the waiter repeated incredulously. "What are you talking about? The police are coming, aren't they?" Brent and Carter exchanged a meaningful glance, both of them slowly shaking their heads in response to the man's naive question. "You might want to sit down for this." Chapter 8. 9:07 a.m. Several hours had passed since the trio had joined Steve the waiter in the small restaurant just off the strip. The morning sun streamed through the large front windows, casting long shadows across the dining room, where the three survivors sat in relative silence around a table in the middle of the space. The restaurant itself was modest but clean, with about a dozen tables covered in red, checkered tablecloths and matching chairs. Framed photographs of Italian countryside dotted the walls, and the lingering aroma of garlic and herbs suggested this had been a popular spot before the world went to hell. Outside, the sounds of zombies running wild in the streets continued unabated, their moans and shuffling footsteps creating a constant background symphony of horror. Occasionally, their bloody hands would smack against the front windows whenever they sensed movement inside, leaving crimson smears on the glass that caught the morning light. "We need to find something to block the windows with," Felicia said, wrapping her arms around herself as she watched another creature press its face against the glass. "Don't worry, those things can't get in here," Carter replied, though his voice lacked complete conviction. "Do you really want to bet your life on that?" Felicia challenged, raising an eyebrow. Carter considered her question for a moment, watching as more zombies gathered outside their position. The glass was thick, but it wasn't designed to withstand a sustained assault from desperate creatures. "Okay, you make a good point," he conceded with a nod. "We'll ask Steve when he gets back from the kitchen." As if summoned by their conversation, Steve emerged from the back of the restaurant carrying a large tray loaded with food. The waiter looked surprisingly composed given their circumstances, though there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept much. "I hope this is all right," Steve said as he approached their table. "I kind of had to put down the chef this morning." The casual way he delivered this information about killing his coworker was jarring, but the incredible scent of eggs, sausage, bacon, and fresh coffee that wafted from the tray immediately captured everyone's attention and made their stomachs growl with hunger. Based on the smell alone, Brent said with appreciation. "I think you're my new favorite person in the world." Steve set the tray down on a neighboring table and began grabbing plates, handing them out to each person before taking one for himself. The 4 survivors gathered around the table, and despite everything they had been through, they began digging into what might have been the best breakfast any of them had ever tasted. They remained silent for several minutes, each person focused entirely on stuffing food into their faces as quickly as possible. The simple act of eating something warm and freshly prepared felt like a luxury beyond measure after the night they had endured. Besides, there wasn't much left to discuss, since the group had already spent considerable time bringing Steve up to speed on just how dire their overall situation really was. The waiter had taken the news about the collapse of civilization surprisingly well, all things considered. Finally, as the plates began to empty and their immediate hunger was satisfied, the conversation picked up again. "Is there more of this back in the kitchen?" Carter asked, gesturing toward the remains of their feast. "Oh yeah, we got a delivery truck just a couple days ago, and it only comes once a week," Steve explained with obvious pride in his preparation. "Not just fresh stuff either, but there's plenty of canned goods and dried ingredients as well. It should last the 4 of us quite a while if we're careful about portions." "That's good news," Brent said, "because it might be a while before we get out of here." "Speaking of getting out," Carter interjected, "we were talking earlier about blocking out those front windows. Every time we move around in here, those things start beating on the glass," Felicia explained, nodding toward the front of the restaurant. "I figured it couldn't hurt to hang something over them so they can't see us moving around inside." "That shouldn't be a problem at all," Steve replied thoughtfully. "There are more than enough spare tablecloths in the back storage area to get all the windows covered properly." "All right, well, I'll finish my coffee and get started on that," Carter said, taking another sip of the surprisingly good brew. "I can give you a hand if you'd like," Steve offered. "Nah, man, you've done more than enough for us already," Brent said gratefully. "Just sit back and enjoy your coffee. Carter and I have got this covered." "Well, I certainly appreciate that, Brent," Steve said with a tired smile. "You'll find the storage area just to the right when you walk into the kitchen. There's a toolbox on the floor there too. Should have everything you need." "Carter, I'll grab the supplies if you want to finish up here," Brent offered, pushing back from the table. Carter raised his coffee cup in a mock toast to his friend as Brent got up and headed toward the kitchen. The back area was larger than it had appeared from the dining room, with industrial-grade equipment and stainless steel surfaces that reflected the overhead lighting. Brent looked around until he spotted the storage area Steve had mentioned, complete with neatly folded tablecloths and a well-organized toolbox sitting on the floor nearby. He stopped just short of gathering the supplies, pulling out his cell phone and looking at the screen with desperate hope. His heart sank when he saw there still wasn't a call or text from Diane, despite all his attempts to reach her throughout the night. He stared at the device for a long moment, his thumb hovering over her contact information, as he debated whether to try calling her again. "You've already left a dozen voicemails and sent twice that many texts," he muttered to himself. "She'll call you when she wakes up. You know she's always been a heavy sleeper on her days off." With considerable effort, Brent pocketed the phone and focused on the task at hand. He gathered up an armload of tablecloths, along with some hammers and a box of nails from the toolbox. With everything he needed in hand, he returned to the dining room. "Come on, Carter, time's a-wasting," Brent announced. Carter drained the last of his coffee and stood up, taking some of the tablecloths from his friend as they headed toward the front of the restaurant. The windows facing the street were enormous, nearly extending from floor to ceiling, with only a couple of feet at the top and bottom, where the wooden frame provided mounting points. "I'll grab a chair and take care of nailing them to the top," Carter said, already scanning the room for a suitable piece of furniture. Brent nodded as Carter selected a sturdy wooden chair and dragged it over to the first window. The two friends worked as an efficient team, with Brent positioning the tablecloth and passing up nails for Carter to hammer into the wooden frame above the glass. They had managed to cover a couple of the larger windows when Brent suddenly heard a low rumbling sound coming from somewhere in the distance. The noise was unlike anything he had heard before, and it was difficult for him to identify exactly what might be causing it. The sound was confusing at first, but it continued to get steadily louder with each passing second, suggesting that whatever was making it was approaching their position. "What is it, man?" Carter asked, pausing in his work and looking down from his perch on the chair. "Just listen," Brent said, holding up a hand for silence. "Do you hear that?" Carter stopped hammering and listened intently, trying to pick up whatever sound had caught Brent's attention. After a moment of concentration, he heard it too, a deep mechanical rumbling that seemed to be cutting through the air above them. "What in the hell is that?" Carter asked, his brow furrowing with concern. "I don't know," Brent replied, "but it sounds huge." The sound continued to grow in intensity, permeating through the restaurant walls and floor, until it became so powerful that it began causing the windows to vibrate in their frames. The rhythmic thumping suggested rotors, large ones. Brent pressed his face up against the glass of the nearest uncovered window, looking down the street to his right, where the sound seemed to be originating. His eyes widened in shock when he spotted two massive military attack helicopters flying low down the strip, their rotors creating downdrafts that scattered debris across the abandoned street. "It's the military!" Brent exclaimed with excitement. He continued watching, trying to see where the ground troops might be positioned, but he could only make out the two helicopters that were flying approximately 30 feet above the road surface. As they approached to within a block of the restaurant, they suddenly stopped their forward progress and began hovering directly above the intersection. "What in the hell are they doing?" Carter asked. "I don't know," Brent replied, "but I don't like the look of this." Several tense moments passed as they watched the helicopters maintain their position above the street. The aircraft seemed to be scanning the area below them, their pilots apparently assessing the situation before taking action. Then, without any warning whatsoever, the miniguns mounted on the front of both choppers suddenly spun to life with a mechanical whine. Within seconds, they were spitting out hundreds of rounds per second onto the road below, the sound of sustained automatic weapons fire drowning out everything else. The armor-piercing bullets ripped through zombies and abandoned cars alike, shredding anything they came into contact with in a display of overwhelming firepower. Bits of metal, chunks of asphalt, and pieces of flesh began smacking against the restaurant's front windows, creating small spider web cracks from the repeated impacts. Brent and Carter stared in complete disbelief at what they were witnessing. The military wasn't attempting to rescue survivors or establish safe zones. They were systematically destroying everything in sight without bothering to check whether any living people might be trapped in the vehicles below. "What the hell are they doing?" Carter shouted over the noise, his voice filled with horror. Before Brent could formulate an answer, several missiles suddenly launched from hardpoints beneath both helicopters, their rocket engines leaving white contrails as they streaked toward targets on the ground. "Get down!" Brent screamed. One of the missiles impacted directly outside the restaurant with tremendous force, the explosion sending a large pickup truck flying through the air like a child's toy. The vehicle crashed through the front windows in a shower of glass and twisted metal, its momentum carrying it deep into the dining room. Carter didn't have enough time to get completely clear of the incoming projectile. The flaming wreckage slammed into his legs with bone-crushing force, pinning him beneath twisted steel and shattered glass as the truck came to rest against the far wall. Brent narrowly avoided being hit as well, the blazing remains of the pickup settling just inches away from where he had thrown himself to the floor. Smoke and dust filled the air, making it difficult to see or breathe properly. He quickly realized what had happened and bounded to his feet, calling out desperately through the chaos. "Carter!" Brent tried to peer through the smoke and debris, searching for any sign of his friend. Instead of seeing Carter, however, he heard him screaming in agony from somewhere near what remained of the restaurant's entrance. Through the haze, Brent could make out several zombies that had apparently survived the explosion and were now descending on Carter's trapped form, tearing into his flesh with renewed hunger. "Carter!" Brent screamed again, starting toward his friend. But before he could take more than a few steps, additional zombies came pouring into the destroyed restaurant through the massive hole where the front windows used to be. The creatures had presumably been shielded from the worst of the blast by being positioned further up the street. Brent realized that attempting a rescue would be suicide. He turned and ran toward the kitchen, where Felicia and Steve had already retreated when the explosion occurred. The waiter was standing in the kitchen doorway, frantically waving him toward the back of the building as zombies began streaming through the dining room in pursuit. "Into the cooler! Into the cooler!" Steve shouted over the chaos. Felicia had already spotted the walk-in refrigeration unit on the left side of the kitchen, and was running toward it as fast as she could manage. She threw open the heavy insulated door and darted inside the cramped space. Brent didn't have time to think or question the plan. Operating on pure survival instinct, he followed Felicia into the cooler just as Steve rushed in behind them, slamming the thick door shut and plunging them into complete darkness. "Sorry, give me just a second," Steve said, his voice muffled by the insulated walls. Steve pulled out his cell phone and activated its flashlight function, using the pale glow to locate the interior light switch. When he found it and flicked it on, the small space was illuminated by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. All three survivors immediately began shivering from the frigid temperature inside the cooler. The air conditioning unit was working overtime to maintain the near-freezing environment necessary to preserve the restaurant's perishable inventory. "Why in the hell did you have us come in here?" Brent asked through chattering teeth. "Because the storage room doesn't have a locking door," Steve explained practically. "This is the only place in the building where we can actually secure ourselves inside." "We're going to freeze to death in here," Felicia said, wrapping her arms around herself in a futile attempt to generate warmth. Steve shook his head and walked over to a large cardboard box filled with fresh oranges. He ripped off the top portion of the container, then walked over to the air conditioning unit and shoved the piece of cardboard into the main vent, blocking the majority of the cold airflow. "A couple more of these and we'll be all right," he said confidently. "We're pretty far from all right, man," Brent replied, his breath visible in the cold air. "Well, relatively speaking," Steve conceded, "those things can't get through this door, and we have plenty of food in here with us. It was the best solution I could come up with on short notice." Brent knew the waiter was absolutely right. Despite the cold and cramped conditions, this was probably the safest place they could be right now. He nodded his thanks toward Steve as the sound of zombies continued to pound against the exterior of the cooler door. The space was small, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, with metal shelving lining the walls and boxes of produce stacked on the floor. The three survivors would have to make the best of very tight quarters for however long they needed to remain hidden. Brent paced back and forth for a moment in the limited space before finally taking a seat on a stack of boxes. He pulled out his phone and stared at the screen, hoping against hope that he had a message waiting for him. His heart suddenly leaped when he saw a new text message from Diane. With trembling fingers, he opened it and read, "I hope you're having fun on your impromptu bachelor party. I love you so much and will call you after my workout." Brent leaned back against the cold metal wall, a genuine smile spreading across his face for the first time in hours. The message meant that his fiancée was still alive and well, apparently going about her normal routine, completely unaware of the nightmare that had engulfed Las Vegas. His mind immediately began racing with possibilities. Maybe this outbreak was only happening in Vegas. Maybe the military response he had witnessed was actually effective at containing the situation. Maybe things were going to be okay after all, and this would just become a terrifying story to tell at their wedding. He looked over at Felicia and Steve, who both appeared cold and defeated, their bodies tensing with every zombie fist that smacked against the cooler door. Despite their dire situation and the loss of so many friends, Brent found himself clinging to hope, even if deep down in his heart, he suspected that hope probably wasn't based in reality. The end.